Good afternoon. My name is Neil Ludevig. I'm the CEO of Moon 31, and this is one of the panels taking place for Winter Jazzfest at the Bowers & Wilkins Sound Lounge at the Moxie Hotel. So thank you so much for joining us. We had an incredible weekend of events. We are gearing up for some more events this coming weekend. Taking some time to explain a bit about Winter Jazzfest. This is the 16th year. It started small, but now it reaches more than 16,000 attendees, spans 10 days, takes over 22 venues in 2 boroughs. So there's a lot of things going on. And this talk series is part of that expansion. In the past, we've tackled issues of social justice and equality. This year's focus is on wellness in the arts, tackling some of the issues that are really important and often taboo, everything from mental health and wellness and substance abuse and recovery, and many of the issues that are facing artists, the artists that are inspiring us today. Today we've brought together a few of the people that work with artists in a lot of different regards. There are turbulent times happening around the world, and the issues that artists face are quite varied. So we've brought Ben, David, and Ali to talk a little bit and have a conversation to address some of these things. A special thanks also goes out to Rhodes, who provided some microphones today that these people will be speaking on. But I'm going to turn it over to Ali SACHEDINA, who will start the conversation going. Thanks again for joining us, and see you at the end.
Thanks, Neil. Ali SACHEDINA. I am here with a really eclectic and interesting panel, a bunch of panelists. The subject being turbulent times for international musicians. We wanted to take a moment to focus on a lot of the key areas that, as international musicians, the things that you face as artists, musicians, managers, agents, when entering this market, the U.S. market, and also give you some perspectives on what's going on the outside of the United States and in various international markets, from visas and immigration to touring, changes in copyright laws, to the importance of streaming and what that means to artists, musicians, agents, and the like. I'll take a moment first to turn to my colleagues to allow them to introduce themselves. Dave.
Hey there, my name is David AMAR. I am an immigration lawyer with the Brooklyn-based firm Covey Law and volunteer with the arts nonprofit Tamizdat. So I specialize in O and P visas, which are the main visa types available to foreign artists. So we work together in securing visa approvals and sort of guiding management, tour management, and artists through the relatively Byzantine process of U.S. immigration for artists.
And to my right, I have Ben Ellison.
Yeah, I'm the artist on the panel.
Yeah.
I'm a bassist and a composer and a producer, and I'm on the faculty of the New School, where I teach classes in entrepreneurship and music business, and I'm on the board of the Recording Academy, where I just termed out as president, but have been very involved in their advocacy efforts. But my day gig is writing and playing and touring and making records. I have 14 records of my own, and I've toured all over the world with my bands and others. And and I also helped start and ran a nonprofit for a number of years called the Jazz Composers Collective, which was focused on presenting music and building audiences for jazz.
Amazing. And myself, Ali SACHEDINA. I'm general counsel to one of India's leading music streaming services, JioSaavn. We are a service that provides music to close to 120 million active users worldwide. We are based here in New York and Mumbai. Formerly, before my current life as general counsel, I was an artist manager and music lawyer for almost 16 years, representing a whole host of international artists. So the kind of challenges that international artists face, particularly when entering this market, is something that I dealt with on a very day-to-day and sometimes successful but often painful basis. So with that, I'll start with perhaps one of the most prevalent and important issues that international artists face, and that's visas. Visas to enter this market, and certainly with the way things stand with our current administration, Should we be concerned? Can you tell us all about what's going on in the visa space?
Yeah, so absolutely. There is, obviously there's cause for concern, and there always has been cause for concern from the day that Congress in the early 90s started this new visa regime, which is the O&P visa process for performing artists. So generally speaking, there are only a few different visa options for performing artists who want to come to the U.S. to work, to perform. And in a lot of situations, visas are a really expensive undertaking. There are many layers of red tape. It's generally known as a pretty horrible process. And so a lot of the time, what many artists and managers try and do, particularly with developing artists, is to figure out what can we do not on a visa, not on a work visa. So as a tourist, as a business visitor. So when you expand the idea of what kind of work permit or what can an artist use to come into the country who's not a U.S. citizen, there are a few different options, but none of them are necessarily great. Most of them are expensive, and in the best situation, you need to plan ahead at least a number of months, which is not always realistic in the life of a performing artist, where sometimes opportunities come up at the last minute, you need to take advantage of them.
So what are the types of visas?
So the main two visas are O and P. The O1 visa is the most commonly referred to as the artist visa or the extraordinary performer visa. In the legal lingo, it is a visa for artists of extraordinary ability. The O1 is a type of visa that's available just to an individual, so just for one person. You can bring support staff, support musicians on what's called an O2 to support that O1 artist. The other main type of visa is the P1. The P1 is a visa for a band, for a group, for a theater company, for a group of individuals that's known as the group. So the example I always kind of think about is the Rolling Stones, for instance, is something that everybody knows. They could be in the U.S. on a P1 visa as the Rolling Stones, or you could have Mick Jagger, the front man, on the O1 as the main artist, and the rest of the band and the crew accompanying him. There are another couple of visa types. The P3 is for artists who the government, in the evaluation process, can determine as a culturally unique performer. Usually we interpret that to mean a performer who's doing something that's unique to a distinct culture or a geographic region or a type of people, an ethnicity, something that American audiences generally don't have easy access to. So as far as working and performing in the States, you're really stuck with just those three categories.
What if I'm playing for free? I mean, if I'm doing a South by Southwest showcase. I'm performing at Winter Music just purely on a promotional basis. I'm not earning any income. Do I need to get a P1 or an O1? Or?
So in the vast majority of circumstances, yes. The U.S. government takes the position that if you are performing in the U.S., you need a visa 99% of the time. There are a few exceptions. Even if you're performing for free, the government takes the position that if you are performing and not getting paid for it, arguably you are taking away a job from an American citizen who could be performing and could be making money from it. That makes sense in some contexts, but in the context of the performing arts, artists are not interchangeable with one another. If you want to see, as an example from Winter Jazzfest this year, if you want to see Moses Boyd come from London to play drums and to see him at the UK Jazz Showcase, if you replace him with an American drummer, if you replace him with Jack DeJohnette, it's a different show. It's not a one-for-one exchange. So there are a couple of different circumstances where the government allows exceptions. One of them are for bona fide industry showcases. So events like South by Southwest or like the APAP conference that's happening in New York right now. But those are they're industry facing. So the government takes the position there that it's not really a performance, it's more like an audition for the managers, for the booking agents, for the parties there who might hire the band in the future. There are a couple of other really limited exceptions, but to really answer the question, if you think that you don't need a visa, you're probably incorrect.
And if I want to roll the dice and say, you know what, I'm just going to do it anyway. I'm going to show up anyway. I'm going to perform because I'm not getting paid. I'm not, barely promoting me. I'm just performing. I'm just part of a showcase or some sort of. It's not really a thing. Is that a really risky thing? And if I get caught, what happens?
Well, nobody's ever done that before. I mean, no, I'm joking. People do this all the time, and people, to tell you the truth, people get away with it a lot of the time until they don't. So artists enter the U.S. often without the proper work visa, but they are often caught coming into the U.S. And at the best case scenario, you're turned away at the border. You are told that you must withdraw your application to enter the country, and it's recorded in your file. It'll sort of stay with you. Worst case scenario, if you're caught lying to the government, you could face up to a 10-year ban from entering the U.S. for any purpose whatsoever. Work or no work, tourist or no tourist, and you need to apply for specific waivers of that ban to enter within the next 10 years. They're not necessarily granted. So the moral of the story is for international artists who are serious about taking their career to the U.S., the work visa is really the only option to avoid that sort of uncertainty.
And is there a way of getting a multiple entry sort of just so that, as an international artist, I'd go again and again and again and try to get the same visa?
Yeah, I mean, one change that's happened in the past 3 years in the current administration is that you used to, once you were approved for a visa once, and these kinds of visas, I should circle back. The P visas are good for up to a year. The O visas are good for up to 3 years. And they're usually multiple entry for that time period for citizens of certain countries who the U.S. has a problem with. I won't say problematic countries. I would say the countries that the U.S. currently has issues with. Sometimes they're not multiple entry, but for those periods, if you have a 3-year O1, you can come in and out of the country at will, usually. You used to be able to, the government used to give deference to prior approvals. If you had an O1 visa once, you could turn around and once it was expiring, you could slap your approval notice right on top of the package and say, I had this visa for the last 3 years, please approve it again. I'm coming back to work for my booking agency for my label. This is the one major change that the Trump administration has implemented, is that they do not anymore give deference to prior approvals. So each application is reviewed what's called de novo, so brand new, fresh eyes. And so you do get instances of artists who have been approved 5, 6, 7 times in the past, and then all of a sudden now the government has decides to take question because there's no policy anymore that you can defer to prior approvals. But generally speaking, to answer your question, once you have the visa and in the validity period, you're essentially good to go, depending on how the visa is structured. If you're an O1, you can do whatever you want as a musician. If you're a P1, you can do whatever you want in the context of that group.
On a side note, I wanted to invite the audience that's listening to, if at any point you have a question, please don't hesitate to wave. We'll bring you in, find you a mic, and happy to address those questions on an ongoing basis. So finally, one last thing about visas. So we describe this as turbulent times for international artists, but have you noticed any particular changes since in these turbulent times as compared to the past with regards to visas?
Yeah, so the artist visa process has always been terrible. It has recently become more terrible in certain ways. It's not an across the board, everything has become unachievable. It's more, and it's less policy changes. It's more the effect of the current administration has emboldened some immigration officers and some government workers to review things with extra scrutiny, to take sort of steps that were maybe not 100% authorized, but call into question things that never would have really been called into question before. By way of an example, the visa process is a two-step thing. First, you file what's called a petition with Immigration Services, and that tells the government who you are. You know, you are the artist that you say you are. You have, you've released records. You're a legitimate artist, and you have upcoming work coming in the U.S. You file that, you get that approved, and then for citizens of most countries, you take that approval sheet, you go to a U.S. consulate in your home country. They do an interview, a 2-minute interview to make sure you are who you say you are. They stamp the visa in your passport. One direct thing that we've been seeing a lot over the last 3 years now is that the interview process, which used to be a formality, is now much stricter. And that's both a cause of the government policies, the effect of the State Department, as well as the current administration's sort of not willing to fill job postings overseas. So what we see is a lot of consular officials who are not particularly trained well, who are calling applications into question when there never would have been a question before. We see delays in scheduling interviews. We see, I advised any of my artists who are from Muslim majority countries, North African countries, leave months for your interview if possible.
Is there generally a recommended window about when? I mean, I know there are expedited processes, I know, but what is are we talking about 8 weeks, 10 weeks? Or what?
I usually advise that if you don't want to pay for any expediting fees, and the expediting fees can really be a killer, especially if you're an artist on a tight budget and you're already having to have tour management costs and you're not keeping your full fee anyway, you should have everything filed at Immigration Services at least 3 months before you want to show up in the U.S. You should try to interview at your consulate at least a month before your entry date is. Best case scenario.
And you mentioned costs, and I'd just get a nice little segue to a real cost driver is the taxation, withholding tax that international artists face when they perform here. So you're an international artist, the venue, your promoter, is obligated to withhold up to 30%, if I'm not mistaken, of your income earned, unless you have in place a sort of an amendment, if you will, a CWA or whatever it's called. Have you seen any particular changes as of recent in the way this is enforced? And we've heard stories of the IRS sitting at Coachella, like as they're writing checks to artists and just saying, nope, withhold 30%, nope, withhold. I mean, they do that at a lot of, is that still an issue?
Yeah, so the CWA withholding and the 30% withholding for foreign artists is definitely a major issue, and it's becoming more and more of a hot button thing. To give a bit of background, on any foreign musician who's performing in the U.S., any venues or presenters, they automatically should be withholding 30% of the artist fee to go to the IRS. And the artist can then file a tax return and claim that money back at the end of the year based on their U.S. income. But a lot of the time, you need that money to continue your tour. For instance, gas money that you need to take home as an artist, the maximum paycheck possible at the end of the night so that it can fund the next stage of your trip. Recently, the IRS, and there's been a program in place called a CWA program, a Central Withholding Agreement, which boils down to you as an artist, you have a discussion with the IRS before your tour, you figure out what your tax rate, your projected tax rate is, and then you don't have to lose the whole 30%. You know, maybe it's 5% or 8% or whatever it is based on your budget. Recently, the IRS got rid of the CWA program for artists that were making less than $10,000 a calendar year per person. After a lot of back and forth, TURBULENT, which is an artists advocacy nonprofit based here in Brooklyn that I do some volunteer work with, has been in talks with the IRS and has come up with a new streamlined withholding agreement that these artists can use. So this is a really big step forward, and it is a sign that when there's some push behind it, and TURBULENT was assisted by the American League of Orchestras, by the Federation of Musicians, by a whole host of performers' rights unions with thousands of constituents, the government is willing to listen sometimes. This is the case of the IRS. It's not necessarily the State Department is going to listen. It's not necessarily that Immigration Service is going to listen, but they might. It just depends on the avenues. A lot of the time, the people that are making decisions at those stages of government aren't really thinking about the big picture. They're thinking about what they see in their desk in front of them. So if there are the right avenues and if there are the right people that get the ear of the IRS, that get the ear of the State Department, talk to the right people there, change is definitely possible, and the government is still more willing to listen than you might automatically believe, at least in 2020.
Well, there is some good news then, hopefully. But let's sort of transition to.
Can I add something? Because I've been listening to this. It's been really fascinating. As I'm as I mentioned, a touring performing artist internationally. But talking about big picture, one thing that hasn't been addressed is what this policy does for U.S. artists and for U.S. presenters, because we've been talking about how challenging it is for artists to apply for visas and how expensive it is for foreign artists to apply for visas, but a lot of times those fees actually fall on the U.S. presenters. So let's not forget that. I want to give a shout out to them because, I know as an artist myself, when I'm performing internationally, if there are visa costs associated with my travel, I'm putting that as part of my contract that presenter, that foreign presenter, has to cover. So it's not as if this policy is really just going towards the foreign artists. It also directly negatively impacts American presenters, and not just financially, but also just the uncertainty and the length of the process. So I have a lot of friends who are presenters, and they'll talk about how they'll have scheduled concerts or festivals that involve foreign artists. I'm sure Winter Jazzfest could attest to this. And all the contracts are signed and all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. And now what we need is the approval of the visa. It's very tenuous if you're a presenter to work in that kind of environment. It kind of, in my opinion, it can stifle people's desire to do this. It's scary.
Yeah, it can chill U.S. presenters wanting to work with foreign artists in the first place because the visas are such a barrier. And you can
and then there's the reciprocal, sorry to interrupt you, but then there's the reciprocal part of that for us U.S. artists, because the U.S. has made it, or it's so tricky for international artists to come here and perform. For us U.S.-based artists, there's a lot of what's the word?
A little bit of reciprocity.
Reciprocity.
Yeah.
Thank you for helping me with that word. Whereby it's challenging for us to go overseas. I know I've had many experiences where my visas actually say on them it's an extra fee for Americans based on the fact that those artists from that country have to pay an extra fee to come here. So there's this kind of tit for tat thing going on that's been going on for decades. But every step that we can take to make this process easier, more streamlined, more equitable, in the spirit of international cooperation and collaboration, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, and when you think about it too, we're here at Winter Jazzfest, and jazz is known as such a collaborative field, right? Where
Absolutely.
If you want to bring a saxophonist or a guitarist from Mali to work on your new album, who you want to tour with because you heard their music and you said, this would be amazing with what I'm currently working on. That's a major investment for you to take on as an artist who just wants to collaborate with somebody else.
I don't know if you're referencing my band that had the Malian musicians in it specifically. Maybe you don't know that about me, but yeah, I did have a band with some Malian musicians, and I dealt with that directly. As a matter of fact,
Okay.
I have memories of going to the Italian consulate and just the hoops we had to jump through to go to Italy as Americans, but with the Malian musician who had a Malian passport but was living in the U.S. with a green card. And just the hoops we had to jump through. It was really, felt very arbitrary, the process. He had to bring his kora down to the consulate and essentially give a concert, which felt, and so here are some people in the consulate who are judging whether or not his kora playing rises to their level of excellence. Who are they? How do they know what good music is? So it just feels, sometimes the process for artists feels very arbitrary and scary.
And not just that, but humiliating as well, where you
Yeah,
have to
absolutely.
prove yourself to the eyes and ears of somebody who, at least when they're reviewing the immigration petitions, it could be the person reviewing the file. It could be a petition for a doctor, petition for a geologist, petition for a Mali and Kora player, petition for a teacher. So
And I understand, because they're not, what do they know about music? It's not necessarily their job to know anything, but on the other hand, you can see how this visa process, they're trying to create systems that apply to everybody, but it can't apply to everybody because everybody's different, and music is it's an infinitely complicated art form.
Is there a recourse for an instance where you, as an international artist, you're rejected? Is there like an appeal, or is there some kind of and I look back on, I represented a lot of South Asian Indian artists, and in most instances I didn't have much of a problem. A few times I did, and it was probably because I filed late, but but it was, and I remember presenters writing to senators and to members of the House of Representatives to get them to implore the immigration authorities here to grant the visa, to grant the interview, whatever it gets to be.
So there are sometimes elements of recourse that you can take, but this goes back to what we were talking about early on, is that this process is not really set up to deal with the reality of the performing arts world. The immigration process is more geared towards a person who has a job offer to come and do a job for 3 years, for 5 years, for whatever. So if there's a delay, well, hey, the job is still there. If there's a delay for artists, the gig is not necessarily there anymore. The gig is probably not going to be there anymore, especially with the costs. A presenter is not going to take another risk on you if your visa didn't come through, whether it's your fault or not.
Right.
So the government can push back on these applications. They can issue what's called requests for evidence. With enough time, those can be overcome relatively easily by competent visa petitioners or consultants or lawyers. And at the end of the day, if you're denied, yes, you can appeal. But by the time it takes you to file an appeal, to go through the court system, the gig is 2 years ago. So the best bet, and how I advise my clients, is if it looks like something is going to go south, we just don't do it. We say, let's push this back, talk to your presenter, pump the brakes, reschedule for something later on, as opposed to fighting the fight and spending everybody's efforts and spending everybody's money on something that may or may not have a resolution, but the resolution might not be there for an extended amount of time.
Talk about a chilling effect.
Yeah.
To me, that's seriously chilling.
And especially if you're a presenter that wants to take an importance, wants to create a social message out there. For example, presenting an artist from Syria, presenting an artist from a country that's currently in the limelight for less than great reasons, because you feel like there's a message that needs to be given. I can imagine that this is something you might step back.
And that's like antithetical to how musicians feel about art, just to kind of bring it back to the musician's perspective. I mean, we're always, this is like a deeply collaborative pursuit. So for us, it's all about those connections. It's all about traveling and reaching new people. It's all about connecting with artists from, other scenes and other communities and other countries. So, it's just...
Well, it's also equally about, and this is a segue into part two, about making a living, from other sources, from your art, from the copyrights that you own and create. And would you mind highlighting some of the concerns that you have noticed at least in the American U.S. sort of ecosystem, music ecosystem, copyright ecosystem, things that are worth pointing out for international musicians and artists?
Well, I mean, one of the big differences between the United States and most developed countries is in the U.S. we do not have a performance royalty for radio. So this is something, it's a long-standing issue. What I mean by that is when a record is played on the radio, the songwriter and the publisher of that song receives a royalty, which is an
That's
important. I mean, music creators rely on royalty streams as a really important part of their income stream.
And that's literally for writing the music, right?
That's for writing the music and then publishing the music. So there's kind of two halves of the song, right? But then there's the recording, which is the artist, whoever recorded that song, right? So,
Which are not necessarily the same person, but
yeah,
they
I mean,
might be,
Whitney
right?
Houston sang the Bodyguard theme, but Dolly Parton wrote the song.
Right.
So when the Bodyguard theme is played on the radio a gazillion times, Dolly Parton as the songwriter and her publisher do okay, but Whitney Houston and now her estate, there's zero money for that. So that's a long-standing problem in America. Most of the rest of the developed world has such a performance right.
A neighboring right, if you will.
Neighboring right is, that's one way to put it, right? So in other words, but the problem is for international artists, when their music is played on U.S. radio, because U.S. radio doesn't have a performance royalty, they're not paid for their work.
That's correct.
And I'm not going to try to say that R word again, but the problem for U.S. artists is, of course, when their music is played on foreign radio stations, that they're not receiving those performance royalties because the U.S. isn't paying their artists for that radio airplay. So there's this kind of, it's silly. It's just something that's gone on for too long, but it's an inequity that has really.
Do you think
hurt artists
there's
for
definitely been
decades.
some lobbying, obviously, to change this? Do you see change in the horizon for?
Yes, as a matter of fact,
Sound
it's
recording
been
owners?
gaining a lot of steam. There's a new act that was just introduced, AMFM Act, but previous to that, it was something called the Fair Play, Fair Pay Act, which our local
catchy.
representative, Gerald Nadler, put forward, and Marshall Blackburn. But there's a new version of it, and essentially would create a performance royalty. So again, this is for when music is played on the radio, and radio is still a multi-billion-dollar industry, believe it or not. Even in this era of streaming, radio is huge. It's still got a lot of, and radio is also streamed, so there's this content that's created.
But for radio that's streamed digitally in a non-interactive, that's sort of in a linear, you can't press forward, rewind. It's sound exchanges would be the society that would collect.
For the performers and the
Writers,
recording rights
writers,
owners.
yeah.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So
Right,
this
but
is-
not for terrestrial radio.
Not for terrestrial
So
radio.
that's
Sound exchange is purely for the digital, non-interactive.
yeah. But there's a lot of radio out
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
So to be clear, though, this is an issue of the money not being collected whatsoever, or is it just a distribution issue?
There's no there's no
It's not there
requirement to get a
whatsoever.
license. In other words,
There's no requirement to get a
yeah,
license,
okay.
so ergo it's not collected. I mean, foreign in other countries, presumably it's collected and kept presumably in some kind of black box escrow thing. Whether or not that exists, I don't know, but the supposition is that there are many billions of dollars that have been collected and presumably are held. It would be a treaty level organization to figure out how to
Right.
get that money transferred. I mean, it would rise to that level, I think. But the first step would be to, plug this hole to create a performance royalty in the U.S.
Beyond just being the thought that counts, right?
Yes.
And for international musicians, their agents, managers, and the like, I guess a bit of practical advice, a takeaway is register with your local society back wherever, in whatever country, France, Europe, wherever it may be. If there is one, register with them. In some cases, you can register with a foreign society. And back in the day when I represented a lot of South Asian, a lot of Indian artists, and the local society, which is IPRS, was in a state of flux, to put it very gently. I would recommend that they register with PRS UK, because PRS UK was relatively easy to register with, as opposed to ASCAP and BMI, which is our US societies, which require a social security number and W8BEN and all that good stuff. The PRS UK actually had a rather streamlined and rather easy process of onboarding international artists. Today, thankfully, India is becoming a little more sophisticated when it comes to that sort of things. But again, we recommend that international artists, musicians always register with their local societies, so that if there is income out there in the U.S. digital and hopefully one day terrestrial ecosystem, they'll be able to get paid for it. Because that's certainly one thing that international artists, big or small, jazz or not otherwise, face is revenue streams. And and especially, it's a bit strange considering that when I joined the music industry in, I think it was 2001, it was at the beginning of seemingly the end of the recorded industry. Like literally Napster had begun to take hold, piracy was rampant, file sharing and the like. And I decided to join the music industry. And it's great because I saw it at what I felt was its lowest point. But it's turned around a lot in the past, I think 4 years, especially with the advent of streaming. Just before this panel, I was reading some statistics saying that, there was a 9% growth in the global music industry. It's certainly, right now, it's $19.1 billion. It's a global, and at its low point, it was around 10 or 11. So there has been a rather incredible growth, and streaming digital music streaming plays a very large part in that today. And it's, in the U.S. alone, sort of mind-blowing statistic, 1 trillion streams took place in the U.S. alone. Close to 7 billion songs were streamed. But the interesting thing was, if I'm reading my statistics correctly, close to 180, almost 200 billion of those, 7 billion streams, 7 trillion streams came from 1,000 artists. So it's a
small piece of
the pie. It's a very
pie.
small piece of the pie. And add to the mix, like the fact that, something international artists, all artists, forget international ones, but all artists definitely are correct to point out is that their share of the pie is seemingly meaningless. Like whether it's from YouTube or DSPs, and I represent one, so I work for one. We definitely recognize the fact that there's an inequity, especially in the music publishing space, and which is something I'm sure artists.
Yeah, well, I mean, it has to do in a way with the kind of disparity, as you say. There's some artists. I mean, the same thing that's happening in music in a way has happened throughout society, you might say, in that there is a big kind of income disparity, and there's a streaming disparity that exists, right? So there are a few artists who have been streamed massively, and that's turned into serious revenue for them and the record labels. The record labels for sure, and them if if their contracts allowed for it. But for the rest of artists, it's been exceedingly difficult, right? So I mean, where 10 years ago, speaking as an indie artist, if you were to sell a couple thousand records, that would be CDs. Mm. That would be cool. I mean, you could probably take that money and definitely make your next record. Right. Which is pretty much what we all want to do, is take that money and make the next record. Now, 1,000 streams is going to turn into a couple of pennies. It's really not going to make a difference. So the
How
question
many
is,
tenths of a penny do you need to fund your next album is sort of the question that you need to be asking, right?
That's right. And I mean, you need one of those, how they have mortgage calculators online? You kind of need a streaming calculator. So the point is that it right now we're still in a state of flux. I mean, I've probably been on record for a long time, if you've followed me at all, being hesitant and concerned about streaming because of what I saw as this kind of looming problem. For one thing, the mechanical going away. For a lot of songwriters, the mechanical on a CD is essentially 10 cents a penny. 10 cents a song, but one stream of that song would be hundredths of a penny, right? So it makes sense when there is volume. In other words, if there are many hundreds of thousands of people streaming your record, we indie artists could work our way back to what it felt like 10, 15 years ago in terms of generating income from our records. But we're not there yet. It's good to see that people have embraced streaming. So in terms of the consumer, it's been a boon, right? I mean,
there's close to 260 million paid subscribers on various streaming services.
That's awesome. And the paid subscriptions, I think, from the musician's perspective, really help. I mean, for one thing, they send the message that I think is important, that music has value. It's not valueless. It's not something that you should just assume is free. Even if you click through an ad or annoyed by an ad, it's essentially free for a lot of people still. And I'm not a huge fan of that. I mean, in a way, it helps build up a market, but the promise is that the market keeps going up, and eventually all boats rise with this rising tide. That's what we would hope for. We're getting there, but we still have a long way to go.
For all the sort of less than favorable elements of the sort of the financial windfall of music streaming for international musicians or musicians in general, there are fair number of positive sides to what streaming does offer to artists and international musicians. Certainly, if you're an international musician, since we're at the Winter Jazz Fest, we can sort of focus on jazz in particular, but if you're a jazz artist and you want to know a little bit more about your market, there are tools available on various services sort of that offer artists the ability, dashboards, if you will, that offer artists a certain lot of insights into geographic regions where their music is performed. It's certainly sometimes the information is a little more granular, but there are tools available to them
Right.
and to their agents and managers. What is your experience with? Have you used these tools, or do you think they're useful?
I think that's a great thing. That's actually something I think, if I may say, the reason that we have those now is that for quite a long time, artists have been screaming for them, because our feeling is, okay, so yeah, we're not making any money off of this now, but we buy the argument that it has a huge promotional value and a music discovery value to it, right? So the idea is that many more people could possibly hear your music that might not otherwise have heard it, which we totally value. But that's only valuable for us if we know who those people are. So artists for a decade at least have been clamoring for this access to this data. I mean, artists are not expecting to get email addresses of subscribers. But on the other hand, knowing who's listening to our music and where, and knowing a little bit about them can be really helpful, because then we can, like for instance, I could say, well, there's a lot of people listening to my new record in Chicago. Let's get a gig there and go there, right?
Yeah.
And no one's listening to it in Richmond, so maybe we should do an extra push, or maybe we should just skip that town entirely. At least we know what's out there, and we're trying to figure out ways to use that information to our, to connect with our audience, which is really what we want to do.
You can immediately know if you're big in Japan, as
That's
opposed to just that being a projection or a prediction. You know
Right,
where
because
the
that
dollars can come
data,
from.
that user data, it has value, and I would argue that's kind of the value of streaming platforms as far as the
We have
business
our-
model goes.
So we have our first question. Why don't you come on in?
Question.
You can just slide the door. Yeah. And I believe that there's a
Is there a
mic.
microphone?
If there isn't a mic, I'm happy to repeat the question. Oh, there we go. There is a mic.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Reggie Sylvester. And I say before I ask this question, if this question gets any of you in trouble, don't answer it. I'm sensitive to the situation. And Reggie Sylvester, by the way, I was with Burn Nix on, I have a record on ESP, and I have a band, the Human Hearts Trio with Lindsey Wilson, but we're not signed. How does what happened about 10 days ago with Mr. Trump, how does that move that was made influence the whole international touring thing? Because what I really want to do an international tour. I really do. Haven't done it yet. But the thing is, I wouldn't want a situation where in a year's time, as Americans, we become the ugly Americans, if you get what I mean. Okay? If this question is too controversial, don't answer it, because I don't want to get you guys in trouble. Thank you.
No, and
Great
thank you
question.
so much. And I can speak a little bit to sort of the visa and the reciprocity side of that question. We haven't touched on this yet, but one of the major points of the Trump era as far as immigration goes has been the travel ban for citizens of 6, 7, mostly Muslim majority countries. Iran is one of those countries. If you are an Iranian citizen already for the last almost 3 years, you cannot get into the U.S. for any reason, legitimate or otherwise, absent an extremely involved waiver process. You have to apply to the government for, even if you have the work permit, you get your petition approved. If you are traveling on an Iranian passport, it doesn't matter how legitimate, how famous you are, you cannot come in, period, unless you apply for special permission. They don't have to grant it. So that has already been something that we have been really trying to push back against. As was pretty well publicized in the news, it was originally publicized as a Muslim ban. He got around it, and it's now a travel ban for certain countries. But the effects of that have been real. There's a whole host of performing arts organizations that have had to cancel tours for bringing high-profile Iranian artists to the U.S. that have really had to eat an incredible amount of money just for wanting to put on a presentation that is legitimate, culturally unique. So as far as what we can see on the other side, I think it's totally feasible to think that if there's any more adverse action on the U.S.'s side, it could lead to barriers like that possibly being imposed upon U.S. citizens. I mean, we have no real way of knowing, but
I can
the way
attest
that
to it. So we do have a way of knowing. Oh yeah,
Really?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've had serious challenges with that. And I was inches away from, speaking of Iran, going there and performing, and yeah, it's very complicated. I mean, leaving aside the sanctions, which make it impossible to exchange financial arrangements, you've also got all the travel stuff. It gets really complicated. Really, artists just want to play. I mean, we just want to do a concert, and there's so many hoops that you end up feeling like.
But if
what's
you're
the
an
point?
American artist like Reggie, I'm assuming U.S. citizen, sorry, U.S. artist, U.S.-based artist, U.S. citizen, and you want to perform in, let's say, European countries or European circuit over the summer, the jazz circuit, like festival circuit. What is necessarily happening on the political arena isn't going to, I don't think, my experience, and I could be wrong, won't necessarily affect your ability to secure visas to perform in, let's say, the EU or let's say in Canada. I don't think you're going to be damned by association necessarily. You know what I mean? But that is at least my experience.
Unless you've got a Malian musician in your
Unless,
band,
yeah.
in which case you're totally out of luck.
And there's another. We were just talking about this before we came onto the panel, but there is a policy called visa reciprocity, and that means if the U.S. or if one country imposes a certain fee on citizens of another country to do a certain type of work, the U.S. will turn around and, for good reason or not, apply that same fee right back to nationals of the other country. So the example that we were discussing is there is a visa reciprocity fee for citizens of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So when U.S. citizens go to work in the Congo, they pay an extra fee, a visa issuance fee, to go and work there full time. When that happens the other way around, when there's a $250 a head fee for a Congolese musician coming to the U.S., that could be insurmountable in a lot of cases, where $250 for an American citizen going to work at an NGO in the Congo is maybe something that's paid for by their company, whatever. The other side, it looks a lot worse, and the reality of that is $250 can be a pretty incredible amount of money that can, that is sometimes make or break.
Thank you.
Very welcome. So, first of all, let's check the time. Just completely gone over.
We got 5-10 minutes, I think.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? We have about 5 or 10 minutes. Yes, please, come on in. There's a microphone right there on the...
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good
My
afternoon.
name is Kim.
Hi.
Hey, Kim.
Could you speak at all about Cuba? I'm not sure what's going on with Cuba.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the visa world, the U.S. has not had a consulate in Cuba for a number of years now, obviously because of the diplomatic situation. And I guess particularly since we're at Winter Jazzfest, there's this huge tradition of Cuban musicians in the jazz world. What this means in practice is that Cuban nationals can absolutely get U.S. visas, but they can't do it in Cuba. So they need to travel to Mexico, to a neighboring country, to
Canada,
somewhere
something,
else,
yeah.
to Canada,
Right.
hang out in that country, apply for the visa, and then wait to get their U.S. visa. So it's possible, but a lot of the time that travel cost and the cost to go to the other country, give your passport to the consulate, wait however long it takes for them to stamp the visa and turn it around. Most cases it's only a couple of days, but what if you have the same name as somebody who's on a watch list or something like that? Then complications like that can happen. But thankfully there's no ban on Cubans. There is just there's that extra hoop to jump through for sure.
So like previous administrations, like back when, say, Buena Vista Social Club. I don't know if that is even relevant, but I mean, and we didn't have the diplomatic,
The freeze.
that we had. I mean, can something like that still happen? Cultural exchange, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. It is, although, and I suppose in the last couple of years, how we've seen the U.S., I guess, vacillate between opening up and closing off. We've seen more opportunity for collaboration. I think that the situation, depending the political situation, I think that Cuba is, although they're not particularly well off compared to most of the world, it's the problems that Cuban nationals face are across the board not quite as serious. As far as visa issuance and passport privilege and all that, are not as worse as, say, North Africans or Middle Easterns for the most part.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question.
Any other questions out there? So, well, before I close out, I just want to, our service, the GeoSavin service, is, majority, large portion of our user base is in India. And India, as being a country of a pretty immense scale, largely English-speaking as well, has been an interest for a lot of American or international artists about jazz artists. Like, hey, what are the touring opportunities? What are the revenue opportunities in India? And and this is a large advent of the proliferation of streaming services, YouTube, for better or for worse. Being available, of sort of internet connectivity sort of permeating throughout India, that jazz, at least from what I have gleaned and what I've begun to see, this has become increasingly important as a genre that's listened to on a regular basis. People spend money on. Certainly, it's not going to be the same thing as EDM, obviously, but international repertoire, like for example, on our platform, international repertoire in 2014 constituted like 8% of all our market share today. It's up to upwards of 20 some odd percent. In other words, wow. People are listening to more international repertoire, more as opposed to solely Bollywood or Indian or regional music. There are festivals that are programming a lot more jazz. There are venues in Delhi and in Bombay that exclusively play jazz. Small little venues, great sound, good backline, and a rather regular audience.
It's not a niche market anymore.
Yeah, it's no longer niche. It's no longer. I mean, India's had its history of jazz, dating back like to the 40s and 50s, but we've begun to see a lot, especially as jazz has sort of begun to permeate sort of the mainstream here in terms of with its interest in electronic music and its break into certainly into hip hop, which has always sort of been there. But as we see those genres develop in India, we see a lot of really interesting opportunities. It's hard to make a meaningful existence, sort of sustaining sort of living as a jazz musician in India, but it's certainly if you're routing through, Asia or Europe on your way to Australia, like during a touring season, I would definitely suggest you reach out to. They're just really easy to find who they are. Festivals and promoters who bring really good jazz out there. So definitely look into that market. And that's anything else you want to add?
I love that. That's brilliant. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, just finishing up as an instrumental jazz musician, because many jazz musicians are instrumental musicians. A lot of the music we perform has no vocals or lyrics or anything, so it sounds the same in India as
In
it
any
does
language.
in Greenwich
Yeah.
Village. Yeah, that's right. It sounds the same in any language, which is kind of cool.
And also the history of collaboration, of improvisation. It's something that, it's sort of core to what Indian classical music is all about. And so I think it's,
We've always had a fertile. There's always been a
exactly.
fertile cross-cultural
absolutely.
connection as far as music is concerned.
Yeah, so it's I definitely would strongly recommend that anyone take a closer look at the opportunities that are there.
Nice.
I think that's it for us. Is that are we okay? Yep. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to the Winter Jazz Fest and Bowers Wilkins for sponsoring and supporting this, and to Rode Mics for these amazing mics. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.